Okay, friends, James Corbett here, CorbettReport.com. Let's move on to the question from Zeiderberg, who writes, I feel that we have three ideologies that are shaping and guiding the world. We have the Zionists, the neoconservatives, and a financial ideology, fractional reserve banking, which is the undergirding the entire structure. Two of these seem to be nationalist ideologies, while the financial institutions reach are global. Are these all one and the same, or will the banking institutions latch on to any nation that can carry them further to a world currency and government? Okay, this is such a huge question, but such an important one. I think that this relates to something that I've been really trying to articulate recently. One of the most detailed podcasts I think I've done probably ever, one on China and the New World Order, which gets into the question of the China-NATO Cold War. Is this a war? Are they connected at the top? My take on this, the way that I'm trying to describe it these days, and maybe you could tell me if it's a good way of describing it, but I think it's 2D chess versus 3D chess. So people might have seen Star Trek with the 3D chessboard where pieces can move up and down as well as left and right. I think what we're looking at is the chessboard two-dimensionally, and we see the nation-state system, the global map there, and we see like a Risk game putting pieces here and there, and this nation-state trying to get the resources of this area of the board, etc. And that 2D game that's going on is very real, and it's really taking place, and there are real people in that system, invested in that system, working towards the continuance of that system, and who really are fighting for one or another side in this sort of nation-state game. But above and beyond that is the guiding ideology of, I think, the upper part of the powers that shouldn't be, which is the globalist ideology, trying to ultimately, of course, get it into a one world government, one currency system, complete control over everything. And again, this is not new. I mean, this idea, this quest has been going on for thousands of years. The Caesars of the world and what have you have always attempted to rule over the world and unite it under one system. I think the powers that shouldn't be, the elite of our time, are doing the same thing. So that's the sort of the 3D chess game, and from that perspective, the ultimate outcome of the 2D chess game has to be that nation-states fight nation-states. It's horrible, it's bloody, people get wiped off the map, there's carnage, people at the bottom of the pyramid are crying out, oh, just make it stop, anything to make it stop. Global government descends as the answer, the solution from on high. This is, I think, the real strategy of what's going on here. So yes, there are various nationalist-led ideologies. You point out the Zionists, the neocons. I think actually they're pretty much the same thing. But there are other nationalist ideologies, there are other 2D game kind of ideologies that play off against each other. But at the end of the day, I think it's the 3D chess game that's more important, because it's ultimately steering us, no matter which side of that 2D chess game that we go for, it's steering us towards the ultimate end goal of global governance. Global governance is the new warm and fuzzy phrase they want to shove down our throats. So it's a very complicated system. As I say, I'm going to be putting out a China and the New World Order podcast that's exceptionally important. I hope people get it and spread it to the four winds. It contains some important information about the way that the Chinese elite connect up with the Anglo-American establishment elite identified by Carol Quigley, and how all of this functions at that upper level to puppeteer the 2D game that's taking place. And that doesn't mean that the 2D game isn't taking place. It certainly is, and it certainly could result in actual military confrontation or economic confrontation or cyber warfare confrontation. And that confrontation is real and really happening, but at the same time it's being directed for a purpose. So a lot more to say on that. I hope you'll stay tuned for that podcast. China and the New World Order. This is a topic that I've been researching in one form or another for a few years now. It starts in a position that I think most of us will be familiar with. If you are even glancingly looking at the headlines this day and age, you will note that there is an undeniable, a demonstrable buildup of diplomatic, financial, and military tensions between the NATO powers on one side and China and its allies on the other.
Tomorrow there will be a formal announcement that Australian dollars can be directly traded into renminbi, into the Chinese currency RMB here in China. The third currency in the world to do so, after the US dollar and the Japanese yen.
This is another small step in China's campaign to increase international use of its currency. China has launched other new currency pairs in recent years, including the Canadian dollar, Malaysian ringgit, and Hong Kong dollar. The deal is meant to help promote business between the two countries by allowing trade without using the US dollar as an intermediary.
This phenomena, as I say, is fairly self-evident, even if you are only looking at the headlines of today's news. But if you are only looking at the headlines, then you might have missed a very different set of data, indicating a very different and perhaps directly contradictory narrative, one that paints China and its supposed foes in the West not as allies pitted against each other, but as partners, however uneasily, in some sort of alliance that will set the tone for the 21st century.
Evelyn de Rothschild joins us now to talk about investing in China and his latest venture, Weather Central, here as well. So Evelyn, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I just want to get your views on how things have evolved. Has it become a more open society? Has it become an easier place to do business?
Oh, I think it is, no doubt. I think it's a remarkable country. When you think of what has happened in the last 10 years, let alone 20 years, is an achievement beyond recognition.
What sort of a financial deal should Obama be seeking to strike when he travels to China next month?
No, I think this would be the time, because you really need to bring China into the creation of a new world order, financial world order.
So Evelyn, what about the RMB situation? You mentioned a so-called currency problem. I mean, do you see the day in the next 5 years where it's fully convertible and flexible?
I think we've all got to move towards that opportunity, and I think the challenge also is whether we should move towards an international currency.
But they really are issues of the construction of a new world order. That's what this is about. And that's the sort of dialogue the Chinese are generally good at. And so a partnership between us is essential. A conflict between us is going to exhaust us both in tactical exercises that cannot be conclusive.
And the New World Order could satisfy both.
It has to satisfy both, because otherwise it will lead to tensions that will exhaust us both.
One has to give credit to President Nixon's and Henry Kissinger's initiative. They broke the ice. They did. But they confronted a residue of suspicion, and that suspicion was mutual, and grievances, and they were also mutual, that it really took time for the relationship to sort of become more normal, more predictable, and eventually what we accomplished was that it became, in fact, open and full, comprehensive, and in fact initiated a kind of secret collaboration, or even perhaps you could call it an alliance.
And so we have on one hand the fiery and bellicose rhetoric of the would-be belligerents of the Cold War of the 21st century, and on the other hand the conciliatory or even cooperative pronouncements of the usual gaggle of super gophers, the superclass identified by Henry Kissinger protege David Rothkopf in his recent book of the same name that identified about 6,000 global actors able to implement transnational policy agendas thanks to their political and financial influence. Are these two positions, which seem to go head-on and seem to be completely irreconcilable, in fact resolvable if we look at this not as a two-dimensional surface-level conflict taking place between nation-states or groupings of nation-states on the geopolitical chessboard, but in fact a three-dimensional problem that involves hierarchies of control vying in different levels of this game for different squares, not just squares of a chessboard, but a 3D chessboard, if we can extend the metaphor. In fact, that is exactly the position I would take, and as strange as that might seem, as difficult as it might be to wrap our heads around that type of conflict, which is happening at one level, which is actually cooperation at another level, it should be noted that this is not the first time in history that we've noticed this type of phenomenon, and in fact, even within the past century, we noticed very, very similar, analogous, one would almost say template or prototypical examples of this very phenomenon, as identified by a researcher who I have name-checked. I am referring, of course, to Anthony C. Sudden, the author of such trade books as Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, Wall Street and FDR, but also the author of many scholarly publications, academic publications that were published under the auspices of the Hoover Institute in the 1970s and that have been well-regarded scholarly works that were even name-checked by the likes of Zbigniew Brzezinski as being convincing proof of their thesis that these books were forwarding. And that thesis revolved around the idea that in the case of, for example, the Bolshevik Revolution or the rise of the Nazis, that it was the Western powers, specifically the financial center of Wall Street and the Wall Street bankers, who were helping to fund their supposed arch-enemies, the socialists of various stripes, whether that be the Bolsheviks or the National Socialists in Germany, for their own agenda purposes.
The series I wrote at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University concerned the transfers of Western technology to the Soviet Union since 1917. They concerned the build-up of the three types of socialism: Bolshevik socialism in Russia, what we might call welfare socialism in the United States, and Hitlerian or National Socialism. And each book examines the financing and the contributions made by Wall Street, by international bankers, to the development of that specific form of socialism.
But the obvious question here is, why? Why on earth would these crony capitalists be funding their erstwhile, supposed, nominal, arch-nemesis rival enemies, their sworn enemies, the socialists? These are directly contradictory ideologies and viewpoints and economic systems. Why on earth would the capitalists be supporting the socialists in various countries? This seems completely nonsensical if we look at it from that two-dimensional, surface-level reality. But if we extend this out to the three-dimensional hierarchical reality, we start to realize that there are agendas that can be served by the crony capitalists supporting command and control economical structures and political authoritarian structures in various countries.
Why is to bring about, I suspect, a plan to control world society in which you and I won't find the freedoms to believe and think and do as we believe.
These power brokers actually envision at that time a one-world government that would be socialist?
Yes. The second statement I made was that they did not want the Soviet Union to develop into another free enterprise society, and that this would offset it. Aiding the revolution would offset this event. That was made as a statement in 1919. You have various books, one by Gillette, the razor blade Gillette, called The City, which laid out this corporate socialism for the world to see as early as, 1905, 1910. So around the turn of the century, you begin to see actually written statements by these internationalist businessmen of the kind of socialist empire they wanted to bring about. It's there, but these books, of course, are not included in your courses in political science and history at the regular universities.
And so we're beginning to develop a thesis that I like to think of as a revision or updating or extending of the thesis of Anthony Sutton into the 21st century US versus China paradigm, which looks, I think, very similar in some ways to the US versus Russia, the US versus Nazi Germany paradigm of the 20th century. I say it's a revision, an updating, and extending of that thesis because I would posit that the form of the thesis that this takes when we apply it towards the supposed battle between the American capitalists and the Chinese communists is in fact the agenda to forward the development of a system of one-world governmental control that involves the merger of capitalist and socialist systems into a system that contains the worst of both worlds. We have the Chinese version of Red Capitalism, which represents both the command and control, top-down political authoritarianism and the bankster-controlled economic crony capitalism that is the model for the New World Order. So let's start putting some of those pieces on this chessboard and see if it makes sense as the new great game. Let's start with the idea, for example, when Sutton was talking about the rise of the Bolsheviks, the rise of the Nazis, he was talking about the various ways in which these movements were funded and supported and aided and built into the position that they could become the dominant forces in those societies. And do we have a parallel with the communist Chinese, obviously taking over the country in 1949? The US, not necessarily the government, but influential people in this super gopher, superclass category, were actually helping to support Mao and the communists. CIA station chiefs having claimed that the CIA was covertly supporting Mao. And we'll start with an edition of the Yale Daily News. It contains a front page story, a very interesting one, called Yale Group Spurs Mao's Emergence. And without Yale's support, Mao Zedong may have never risen from obscurity to command China. If he was to develop a reputation in socialist circles, he had to find a forum to propagate his views. At this crucial point, the student union of Yale and China invited Mao to take over the editorship of their journal. Mao accepted the position and changed the format of the student magazine. It would now deal with social criticism and current problems and focus on thought reorientation. Thought reorientation. That is a very intriguing name for brainwashing or reprogramming or whatever we want to call it. But again, a very tantalizing piece of the puzzle, and one that has been a certain amount of hay made from this. There was a Yale and China connection to Mao. And Yale, of course, the home of Skull and Bones. So there is the specter of Skull and Bones over this relationship. And there has been some hay made of that connection. For example, perhaps most notably in an oft-cited article, January 26, 1990 edition of the New Federalist, called Bush's China Policy, Skull and Bones. This article reads, quote, George Bush, the first U.S. diplomatic representative to the People's Republic of China back in 1973, was a member of Skull and Bones. So were his father, brother, son, uncle, nephew, and several cousins. Winston Lord, the Reagan-Bush administration ambassador to China, was a member. So were his father and several other relatives. James Lilly, the current ambassador to China, was a member of Skull and Bones, as was his brother. Except during the Carter administration, every U.S. ambassador to Beijing since Kissinger's deal with Mao Zedong was a member of the same tiny Yale cult. Mao was a Yalie. Back in 1903, Yale Divinity School established a number of schools and hospitals throughout China that were collectively known as Yale in China. It has since been shown that Yale in China was an intelligence network whose purpose was to destroy the Republican movement of Sun Yat-sen on behalf of the Anglo-American establishment. The Anglo-American establishment hated Sun because he wanted to develop China. On the other hand, they loved the Chinese communists because they intended to keep China backward and were committed to growing dope. One of Yale in China's most important students was Mao Zedong. Took over and started his thought reorientation program that ultimately developed into the Communist Chinese movement. So a very, very interesting connection, and especially interesting to contemplate the connection of all of those various ambassadors to China, which again, up to the point of 1990, every single ambassador except under Carter had been a Skull and Bones member. And of course, that does go back to the early founding of Skull and Bones and the earliest part of it, which of course was the money from the opium trade that the Russell Trust was the holder of, and that family going on to be one of the founders of Skull and Bones. Another very famous, or what should be very infamous, example of a influential Western figure backing that disgusting display that we saw under the reign of Mao was the 1973 New York Times editorial by none other than David Rockefeller under the title From a China Traveler, in which I think he infamously said, "The social experiment in China under Chairman Mao's leadership is one of the most important and successful in human history." One might well ponder who is exactly meant in that we and our. Is that America as a whole, or does that have more to do with Rockefeller, his obvious banking and oil interests, his other ties to the financial and oligarchical elite? I think the latter more so than the former. The long-term game plan has been, at least since the time of the 1970s and the opening up of China, the very idea of merging China's inward focus and its top-down control with the ideas that the West was seeking to import in terms of economic, social, historical systems. How was this actually accomplished? In 1971, in a series of secret meetings that were eventually revealed, of Henry Kissinger to Beijing. It was Kissinger who paved the way for Nixon to normalize relations with China. And who is Kissinger, and who does he work for? From David Rockefeller's own Wikipedia entry, quote, "In Henry Kissinger, Rockefeller found a political operative with an international and domestic perspective similar to his. Kissinger was appointed a director of a seminal Council on Foreign Relations study group on nuclear weapons, of which David was a member. The relationship developed to the point that Kissinger was invited to sit on the board of trustees of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Rockefeller consulted with Kissinger on numerous occasions, as for example in the Chase Bank's interest in Chile, and fully supported his Opening of China initiative in 1971 as it afforded banking opportunities for the Chase Bank." Oh yes, in this formulation, it was Rockefeller supporting Kissinger's initiative to open up China, rather than the other way around. Regardless of the relationship, Kissinger, Rockefeller, two peas in a pod, with the same agenda to open up China from the Mao era of Great Leap Forward and then the Cultural Revolution, which was an interesting time in which Mao did a very astute political maneuver, probably the greatest mass murderer in the history of the world, but he was not necessarily a stupid man, and one does not retain control over a country for that long in those types of revolutionary situations without some politically astute moves. And the Cultural Revolution, in some ways, can be seen as a type of counter-revolution instituted by Mao against the counter-revolutionary tendencies that were taking place within his own party. And it was an interesting maneuver to get the people against the Chinese Communist Party, which was turning against Mao so that he could retain his power. And then, after that point, at the point where the handover took place and Mao was out of power, we started to see a new generation of Chinese leadership taking over. And this is where the story gets extremely interesting and connects again with these same figures of Chase Manhattan, of Rockefeller, Kissinger. All of these figures come together at a very interesting point. And we'll take this from a 1986 work by Michel Chossudovsky, Towards Capitalist Restoration, where he writes, quote, "The 1979 visit of Deng Xiaoping to the US was followed in June 1980 by the equally significant encounter in Wall Street of Rong Yiring, chairman of CITIC, and David Rockefeller. The meeting, held in the penthouse of the Chase Manhattan Bank complex, was attended by senior executives of close to 300 major US corporations. A major agreement was reached between Chase, CITIC, and the Bank of China involving the exchange of specialists and technical personnel to identify and define those areas of the Chinese economy most susceptible to American technology and capital infusion," end quote. Summarized in a December 27, 2012 Bloomberg report, heirs of Mao's comrades rise as new capitalist nobility. A group that was known as the Eight Immortals, and yes, I am not making that up, they're known as the Immortals. And this is a new class of people who have arisen that were connected to 8 people specifically who survived the Cultural Revolution of Mao and were in high-ranking positions in the Chinese Communist Party to start implementing a very different agenda from Mao's agenda in the reign of Deng Xiaoping. There is the 8 Immortals and their progeny, which now are still in control of so many different facets of the state-controlled economy there in China, that it is extremely interesting. The not strictly state-controlled anymore, the now private enterprise/state control hybrid system that China is prototyping for the New World Order system. When we're talking about these 8 immortals and their progeny controlling hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars, ultimately, if we include the Chinese reserves, in all of these various corporations, these state-controlled corporations, this is somehow free market. This is somehow the example of capitalism. So you'll see the way that certain pieces of the narrative are inserted here to try to create false paradigms that are at that two-dimensional stage. It's capitalism versus socialism, and they butt heads, and oh, look what results. I think that's another thing that we and the alternative media really have to be careful about, is what counter-narratives are we propagating, and are they truly counter to the system that is being established? Are they truly counter to the mega-billionaire financial elite interests that are puppeteering this butting of heads of the capitalist and socialist system? We have the gradual buildup of the financial, the economic, the productive, even the investment capacity of foreign Fortune 500, which we should read as the corporate member roster of the Council on Foreign Relations, for example, that's all interlocking, is growing steadily throughout the 1970s, the opening up, the 1980s, the 1990s, and then the 2000 to present region. We are looking at China generally from 2000 on with its remarkable 10-15% GDP growth rate, just its blistering pace of economic growth over the past decade, and as if that sprang out of nowhere and was not the concerted and deliberate product of a very regimented agenda that has been at work for decades now and that has been rigorously planned out from behind the scenes by the crony capitalists and the immortals in China and their progeny. We have to understand this deeper level of what's going on to understand what's happening at the surface level. And that, I think, gives further bolstering to our argument that what's happening is not the 2D surface reality of nation-states pitted against each other, but the 3D hierarchical reality of super gophers at the top, puppeteering a system whereby they can play nation-states against each other to create a global governmental system that will ultimately be this merger of capitalism and socialism, this red capitalism, whatever they want to call it. Let's talk about another key aspect of what Anthony Sutton talked about when he was talking about the Western backing of the Bolsheviks or the Nazis. It was not just financial support, it was not just the development of industry, it was also technology transfers. In fact, that was the specific focus of Sutton's early work at the Hoover Institute, the technological transfers that enabled the rise of the Soviet Union into an industrial superpower from its basically feudal society before the Bolsheviks took over. And in that regard, it was Sutton's argument that without the US technological transfer and technological support, the Bolsheviks couldn't have accomplished what they ultimately did. And similarly, the Nazis couldn't have built up their war machine without the synthetic oil that was provided under specific agreements that Standard Oil had with their German counterparts to provide the technology to create the synthetic oil that fueled the German Nazi war machine that could not have functioned without that. Is there technology transfer going on in China? The short answer is yes. There are technology transfers from the West to China that have enabled certain specific military capabilities that the Chinese now have. Transfer of nuclear technologies, technologies that helped aid China's space program, its missile technologies, its nuclear technologies, including the transfer of microchips and things that happened in the Clinton administration, so it was framed in that left-right debate as if this was some sort of leftist agenda, as opposed to the Bushes supporting the Tiananmen Square massacre, the Clintons supporting with technology transfers. It's left, right, blue, red, fork, spoon. It makes no difference. The agenda is the same, and it's being forwarded by the Rockefellers and the Kissingers and people on that level, not the political puppets who are paraded in front of us as the shadows on Plato's cave wall. These corporations, which were flocking to China to set up their R&D centers and to set up corporate headquarters and all of these other major investments that were taking place, were being done on agreement that this would include technology transfers to the People's Republic of China that maybe could be used to build up China's military base. And now, lo and behold, wouldn't you know it, China is modernizing its military at an exceptionally rapid pace, with aircraft carriers coming online, the latest aircraft carrier killer missiles that they've developed, the drones technology that now is fast approaching that of the United States. It's a military juggernaut that's still in the process of building up, but it is being built up, and how so? This type of report gives us a window into that process, a process that could not take place without the active support of the very financial and corporate oligarchy that has been wedded to the Chinese immortals and the Chinese regime that's been in place at least since the death of Mao. The specifics that Anthony Sutton drew out in the Soviet or Nazi paradigms, we want to construct the same case for what's happening with communist China, because this is about the creation of the one world governmental system, and that cannot take place without A, the nation-state systems warring and ruining each other, and, oh, please save us, oh, luckily there's this model, this structure that's already been put in place that can come save us, of some sort of UN-type structure that will function like the Red Capitalists of China, or something of that sort. This also cannot take place without the active cooperation and the financial, the corporate infrastructure that has been carefully laid out for decades now in agreements between people like Rong Yiren and CITIC and those types of groups, with such things as the US-China Business Council and other extremely fascinatingly interesting groups. Help flesh out this picture that we're painting here, because it is an exceptionally important one that tells a very different story of what we're being asked to believe, that there is a US-China rivalry and that there's going to be some war because they're so at each other's throats. That is taking place at the surface level, but there's a much deeper level of what's taking place in the third dimension that is much more important in the overall game plan. Do not get caught up in choosing sides as if choosing a nation state or a NATO versus Shanghai Cooperation Organization or one of these phony controlled organizations is going to make a difference. At the end, it's a dialectic, and it's going to smash these two seemingly opposed systems into each other, and what's going to result is going to be horrific on the scale of what Chairman Mao instituted in his Great Leap Forward. there's all sorts of manipulations that happen and things that are taking place in the two-dimensional nation-state system version of NED and all of these usual players getting involved in this conflict. But this is part of the conflict that is planned. We have to see it at a deeper level and support the people against these various government and corporate manipulations that have been designed and are taking place. I hope I've placed some of these pieces on the board in a way that the picture comes into view and that you see that this is a system that's being puppeteered in a three-dimensional reality, not the 2D nation-state system fight that we're being asked to believe that it is. I will leave you on one final note, again going back to Anthony C. Sutton, who wrote in 1984 in America's Secret Establishment, "By about the year 2000, Communist China will be a superpower built by American technology and skill." How did Anthony C. Sutton know that? Was he clairvoyant? Was he a psychic? Could he read the future? Was he informed about history? Was he, in effect, an armchair quarterback who, like any good armchair quarterback, knows the opposing team's playbook so well that he can reliably predict their plays?